Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Christina Crow podcast, where we are connecting the dots in search for more balanced mental health. We are needing to make the invisible things visible. In today's episode, I am sitting with my colleague and ADHD couples therapist, John Folks. John is a registered psychotherapist, a clinical supervisor, a certified interpersonal psychotherapist, certified reality therapy choice therapy psychotherapist, a certified professional coach and ADHD coach at Dig a Little Deeper right here in Ontario, Canada. John's areas of specialized expertise include couples or people experiencing long-term romantic relationship challenges, families and couples managing ADHD, and adults themselves individually with ADHD. John uses a blend of tailored psychotherapy and coaching techniques to support ADHD brains. His psychotherapy approach is informed by a blend of psychodynamic therapy, emotionally focused therapy, interpersonal therapy, and solution-focused therapies. John works with individuals 18 up, couples, and families. He is also the author of a book, My Mindful Compass, Bringing Focus into Your Life, a tool that systematically can help people balance the different parts of their lives that need their attention. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me, Christina. Great to be here.
This is a long time coming because John and I often say we should just tape our conversations when we get together and talk about all things ADHD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, having a cup of coffee and thinking, goodness, we should have had that on tape. But here we are. It's great to be here, and this is such an important topic.
Yeah, definitely. So, for you and I, we've been aware of the issue of ADHD showing up in therapy for a while now. But maybe like yourself, I won't speak for you. For me, it's certainly not something I was trained to look for in school or when I was doing my couples therapy training courses either. So for you and your experience, how has ADHD shown up on the couples therapy couch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things that a couple will show up and they'll start into their dialogue, typically led in with complaints. And we're not listening to the complaints typically. Is there something outside of just what we're seeing? We're looking at, okay, well, one person says, well, you don't care about me. And the other person says, yeah, and all you do is nag me. And we go, okay, so that's the content. And that becomes the focus. And typically in that type of dynamic, there is a dance going on, but we don't realize there's actually a third factor that's part of that dance. And so over time, just really becoming more sort of tuned into how ADHD impacts an individual and obviously how it shows up in the couple, you start to be able to hear that the complaints are kind of common in some ways, around impulsivity, hyperactivity, over focusing to inattentiveness. You start to hear those, what are now becoming buzzwords. You're hearing that come into the conversation. So that really starts the process of being really curious. Okay, well, there's the complaint. Now I'm going to start to look at, are there some symptoms that are actually showing up? And that way we actually have a really important sort of framework in the back of our mind to see how it plays out. So instead of jumping in, say, for example, just right at ADHD, we're still looking at the relationship. That's what's most important, right? It's the relational dynamic, and then looking at how ADHD does impact, and it always impacts both people.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's this period of time where, a couple comes in, they've been struggling for a while, and there's probably times in the relationship where it's really good. And then there's times when it's inexplicably feels awful. And they can't quite put their finger on how can we be so good some days and sometimes so awful. And I think the pain point of that inconsistency is really hard for people to describe. And I liked that you used the word symptoms a few seconds ago, because I think the other thing I feel is that people just kind of sometimes think that these traits or these flaws, maybe how they're showing up, are them. And it's really a whole different perspective shift when you recognize that if it's a symptom, that's not your personality. There's a difference between a symptom that's rearing its head as it does from time to time versus who somebody is.
Mhm. Yeah. And, something you're saying is so important, that there's this contrast the couple will experience, saying it, just as you said, it was fantastic then and it's terrible now, and it seems to go back and forth. It's hard to really know where we stand when it's flip-flopping so
Mhm.
much. But one of the things that's a huge problem is that typically if one person has ADHD and they are really that sort of hyper focusing type of personality, and ADHD symptoms actually being exhibited, they'll focus on their new partner, putting all their energy in, and that person on
Yes.
the receiving end of that goes, wow, I have never been loved like this before. I've never
Yeah.
been
It's
so
amazing.
attended to. Yeah, I mean, I'm getting a little bit of a high from this.
Mhm.
And then what happens is over time, real life kicks in, sort of that honeymoon phase starts to sort of fade off a little bit. And the responsibilities of a relationship start to become more important. Being able
Mhm.
to rely on your partner, not just to show up for a date, but when
Yep.
you're actually trying to, live a life together, it means being reliable, dependable, remembering to do certain things, something as simple as
Yep.
paying the bills if you're living together. And the second thing is that not only does that forgetfulness start to come in, and that one partner starts to feel, gosh, am I not as important anymore? Is this the
Yeah.
person that I actually met 6 months
Yeah.
ago, 16 months ago?
Mhm.
And that change becomes so bewildering. And they actually feel, oh my goodness, what I thought was the perfect relationship, I'm starting to realize that's gone. Was I
Yeah.
imagining that?
Right.
So just imagine, Christina, the letdown over time where somebody starts to feel, I don't feel nearly as important as I did in the
Mhm.
beginning. Is there something wrong here?
Yeah. And
Right?
then what happens is partner in that position starts Googling things. And then what they might come up with, and this, as you might know, is like the bane of my existence sometimes. This sounds a lot like something that it's not. So what it sounds like is like a cycle of like love bombing and narcissistic kind of patterns. If you go on Instagram, everyone's ex is a narcissist, you know? And
Mhm.
it's kind of like, well, no, maybe they've just got undiagnosed ADHD, but we'll just figure that out because that can seem kind of self-serving and you only think about yourself because the whole world ends at the tip of your nose and it seems on the outside kind of selfish.
Mhm.
But that's not what's going on the inside, and that's a really important thing. And so that that honeymoon period in the beginning is totally when that person is the focus, the new dopamine hit of the person. It doesn't mean the love's not real. The love's totally real. It's just that that's the intense level of focus. It's like the light is on. And then when the focus goes elsewhere to the other thing that that person is interested in, it's like the light switch has gone off. And it's like you're left out in the dark, which can be terrifying from, attachment perspective even, right? It feels like abandonment.
Mhm. And I think what happens is that when we have somebody that was there and not there, what makes this so tricky is that they may have had an experience growing up where somebody, a
Yeah.
primary caregiver, was there, and then perhaps the family broke up.
Yep.
Now they're not there.
Mhm.
And now you have, in some ways, a repeat of that trauma. And now
Mhm.
you've got so many different factors coming in that compound on top of their attachment
Yep.
history growing up, now their relational dynamic that's changing within the present time, and then
Yep.
ADHD on top of it. And so
Right.
when it is undiagnosed, what happens is that relationship starts to twist and turn over time.
Mhm.
So you have this incredible bond in the beginning.
Mhm.
Then we're starting to get some conflict because obviously one person, it may not be about motivation or intention. It's just simply they're not able to follow through on something. And now we
Yeah.
have anger and we have
Yeah.
resentment. And now we're not communicating. And then it continues to spiral. One of the biggest challenges is this, is that then one person says, gosh, I'm going to have to start being a parent here because my partner is not following through on the basic necessities that are so required for our relationship, that not only does the relational dynamic twist, but the roles start to change. And
Right.
this is where it really starts to get complicated, because as time goes by, each person is actually getting more and more entrenched in their role.
Hmm.
And quite frankly, when we're just trying to survive, we get really good at being in our roles and we don't come up for air.
Hmm.
Months go by, years go by, and
Hmm.
now we have not only untreated, undiagnosed ADHD, but the couple itself, both people attached to the ADHD cycle,
Hmm.
that's not being treated. There's no strategies in place. There's no coaching, there's no therapy, there's no even
Yeah.
investigation into medication to see, what are the best options to support not only an individual, but
Yeah.
also the couple, right?
Right. And then, and then the real life problems compound on top of the emotional problems. So we
Mhm.
feel, we feel disconnected. We feel like, we're walking on eggshells. We can't, rely on our person to be there emotionally for us at the end of the day. Oh, but now like the debtors are calling and maybe somebody lost their job, or maybe we missed a car payment, or maybe we've got conflict with our kids, or maybe now the kids are having trouble in school and we're just too consumed with our own stuff to even be able to help them forget about us, and on and on and on it goes, right? So it starts to like ramp up kind of exponentially sometimes when the stressors are on, and then when the stressors relieve, we catch a bit of a break, right? And so then, because we didn't really know what was driving it underneath, we don't really do anything different about it. And then the next time the cycle starts again, when the stressors pile on, it's almost like we're taken by surprise. Like, holy crap, here we go again. Here's the cycle, you know?
And when it becomes so unpredictable and so random, going into our sort of our defensive or survival mode gets more and more fixed, because
Yeah.
we don't know what's going to happen. The
Yeah.
unpredictability keeps us always in a heightened state. So
Vigilant.
the vigilance is kicked right up. Our central nervous systems are going through the roof. And what
Hmm.
happens is we start to go into those roles even more deeply, and to even consider, okay, well, maybe I need to change what I'm doing. Let's just say
Yeah.
that one person says, well, maybe I'll just have to parent less to see what's going to happen, because
Hmm.
I'm starting to blow my brains out and I can't do everything. I'm so
Yeah.
tired of keeping it all together. And the mere idea of stepping back to create a void to see if their partner will sort of
Scary stuff.
sort of pick up the slack and somehow find some traction.
Yeah.
Perfect word for it. It's scary.
Yep.
And so we're biting our nails, hoping that somehow that vacuum is going to be shored up and our partner is going to show up. And you know what? Sometimes the partner might catch the initial sort of cue. They'll go,
Yeah, for
okay, well, I
sure.
feel right. They feel a little bit less pressure, and they kind of start to remember to do something. And just to your
Hmm.
point, it feels like it's getting better. And all of a sudden, more life pressures kick in. It's a
And
second
there we go
child,
again.
or a
Yeah.
bad report card comes in,
Yeah.
right? There are struggles going on that's this impacting the family, more responsibility. And what's going to happen? It's going to sandwich out, and then it happens all over again. And this is where the entrenchment, this is where it becomes the biggest challenge, is that everybody gets so entrenched. There's a
Yeah.
blame and shame game, and the amount
Yeah.
of anger that therefore communication's lost. They don't feel secure with each other.
Yeah.
There's no
Super
more
defensive all the
compassion.
time. Yeah.
Mhm. And so in the end, they're actually just getting into this fixed place,
Hmm.
expecting the
Hmm.
other person to get
Someone's
fixed.
got to move first, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I
One
think
thing
it's,
that
mhm,
I was going to say, one thing you referenced before is this
mhm,
dynamic that can exist outside of an ADHD dynamic, of course, in couples, which is an overfunctioner and an underfunctioner kind of get together. And the overfunctioner takes great pride in how competent they are. And the underfunctioner is kind of like tired of being criticized, so they just basically stop trying. And on that dynamic goes until the overfunctioner hits the wall and they just can't do it anymore. So then
Mhm.
they come to therapy. And you kind of get to this place where it's wonderful when people can look at themselves and recognize the patterns that will try to work out in therapy together with people. Like it's, so much of it's pattern identification, I think.
Mhm.
And the idea, I think, is for the overfunctioner, just like you said, to pull back a little bit. But I always like to add this piece is, but don't pull back in anger and don't pull back in resentment and in stony silence. We have to let the other person know we're pulling back and here's why we're doing it, and deliver that message in a loving way, because it's kind of a loving thing to do, because what the message we're ultimately sending our partner is like, hey, I trust you that you're going to figure this out. I'm still here, but I'm going to step back, take care of myself. It doesn't mean I don't love you anymore. Of course I do, but I have faith in you. And I know you can handle this. And then if the person who hasn't been, functioning at the greatest level, they can go through what they want to go through. If they want to ask for help, they can ask for help, but no more will their opinion not matter about whether or not they need the help,
Yeah.
from
You
their
know,
partner.
it's such a really powerful way you put it. And what I really heard you say is that it's calibrating, stepping back, right?
Hmm.
And just enough to allow for space for the other person to take
That's it. Yeah.
responsibility for themselves. Because
Yeah.
in the end of the day, the couple and each individual has to take responsibility for themselves. In
Hmm.
other words, if one person is turned into the parent, they have to take responsibility that they have in some ways become the over-functioning partner.
Hmm.
They have to step back and they have to sort of lower their amount of attentiveness and managing of their partner. And
Yeah.
that in some ways requires help. And here's the
Yeah.
reason being is that we've become so angry at managing our partner that if we can't let go of our anger, I mean, over time, we're going to be anxious, feeling depressed, feeling resentful, and if we're not attending that ourselves, even though we may not have ADHD,
Hmm.
we may have some emotional struggles that are actually compounding the ADHD couple dynamic.
Yeah.
So taking responsibility to step back and actually saying, how do I take care of me? This is your point.
Yeah.
Taking care of me, making sure that I'm mentally healthy.
What does that
But
even mean anymore? Right?
right.
Don't get me started.
But how to take
It's
care of
hard.
me, right? Like, what are my values? What are going to be the boundaries that I set up for myself? What are going to be
Mm,
some of the things that I'm going to do to make sure I'm healthier, that I'm actually feeling more calm, and that I'm able to actually be in this relationship more constructively? And
mhm.
meanwhile, the partner who may potentially start to seek out professional help, such as diagnosis, to explore, is medication, for example, an option for them,
Yeah.
therapy or coaching, and all these ways to get treatment. And that it's going to be their responsibility to be
Mhm,
able to actually take those tools that are available to them to help them get traction in their life so
mhm.
that they can actually start feeling better about themselves. I mean, let's be honest. If we've had the message over our lifetime that, you always forget things and you always fail and you let other people down, boy, the
Mm.
self-esteem takes a hit over time.
Yeah,
So if somebody can take responsibility to work on that so that their self-esteem goes up,
yeah,
their mood starts to lift, their energy, and their
yeah,
ability now to return back to the relationship constructively. You now
right,
have two people meeting in the middle or somewhere fairly close to the middle. And
right.
that's actually, Christina, one of the biggest challenges is really getting the blame game to end
Yeah,
and getting people to realize, you know what? We have a factor here.
mhm.
We call
We
it
have
the
to deal with it.
ADHD factor, and we
Yeah,
can deal with it now.
yeah. It's a
Yeah.
really wonderfully solvable problem. It's so we've painted this picture that's quite a disaster, maybe it sounds like to anybody listening, but it's such a solvable problem. So that's kind of the fun part about working with couples. if they don't know that they have ADHD and we're the ones that help connect those dots, the trajectory that people can go on when they do embark on sorting that out is such a privilege to watch people go on that journey. The one thing I'll say, to take a phrase from emotionally focused couples therapy, is, there's a, and I'll let you speak to this, John, because you've got deep expertise in this, but the find the bad guy dance. And I find one thing we have to be careful of as ADHD therapists working with couples is that, well, oh, geez, now we know exactly what the problem is, and it's you, and it's your undiagnosed mental illness, and we got to figure this out. And yeah, it's a variable, to your point, as we deal with it, but we have to be really careful to zoom out, and that's not the only dynamic at play. It's kind of the most obvious one when we look at it, in the same way that someone having an asthma attack obviously is struggling to breathe. It's obvious to everybody. There's a symptom here, right? And once we can treat it, but we can unfairly sometimes, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this as a therapist, focus too much on it. And it's always really important that at the end of the day, like, that's a thing that's a part of them, like having brown hair or being nearsighted. It's not who they are.
Mm.
And bringing compassion to that, into the ways that the dynamic has developed over time, because I think ultimately what happens is we can work our way back to the beginning. Everyone's got to own how we got here and the relationship, and that's hard. That's really hard work, right?
Mhm.
To own your role in something, even if it's as simple as, I didn't know what I didn't know, and knowing what I know now, I might have done some things differently,
Mhm.
right? Because there is, like, nobody teaches us this stuff when we're young.
Yeah. I think really what's important is that when we don't know what we don't know, as I've said before, we get entrenched. But if we can actually have an aha moment to realize,
Mhm.
wait a second, there's a factory here. Ah, okay, that makes sense. That does wonders to have the couple actually sort of sit back for a moment and go, wow, okay, well, we do have a dance between us. And let's blame and make the culprit that dance between us, not each other. And we actually
Mhm.
have one more thing, another ingredient that makes this more potent. Now, using, say, EFT as a lens, but also a working model here, is
Mhm.
that essentially what EFT will talk about is really a tango between two people,
Mhm.
right? So they're on the dance floor. And when the couple first meets, as we said, that somehow the dance is wonderful. Even if some mistakes are along the way, everybody's
It's
happy,
charming.
everybody's forgiving, and it's so
Yes.
charming. Oh, I love the way you stepped on my toe. It's so
Yeah,
wonderful. I
so
love you,
cute.
darling. Yeah. No, a little while later, not so cute. But
Mhm.
here's what's interesting is that tango starts to move its way off the floor. The dance is not looking so cute or pretty anymore. And what's happening is that there's conflict happening. The couple is not as secure, and they're looking at each other as if, you're the one that's making this dance so sloppy.
Mhm.
It's your fault. Well, then
Mhm.
all of a sudden, somebody stops for a minute, takes off their shoe, and inside the shoe is a stone.
Mhm.
It's the ADHD stone.
Mhm.
Wow, we wonder why the one person in the couple had just a slight little symptom or a sidestep that, yes, in some ways it was a factor and did impact the dance between the two partners.
Mhm.
But to your point, that stone's not responsible for the entire dance, but it's
Yeah.
an important piece to be able to go, aha,
Yeah.
wow. And that stone not only impacts the person who has ADHD, but also has a shockwave into the relationship dynamic
Mhm.
where now we have ADHD, the stone, causes a slight misstep for the one
Mhm.
partner, which in itself is a symptom.
Mhm.
And then the other partner reacts to that.
Mhm.
So, in other words, reacts to the misstep. So
Mhm.
now we have another symptom.
Mhm.
And now you have ADHD symptom, symptom,
Mhm.
ADHD symptom, symptom. In the end, we have a dance that's now going off the floor.
Yeah. Let's throw some rejection sensitivity just for you into that.
Well, this is it. That right. And the fact that there's also in gaslighting,
Yeah.
because we're
I didn't do
gaslighting
that.
each other, saying, see, it's
Mm,
you because
yep.
you've got the stone in your shoe. And now that person feels stigmatized.
Oh
And
yeah.
essentially, we're now forgetting that this could be potentially a really powerful asset to the relationship. And
Yep.
it's actually viewed as a liability.
Right.
So really discovering it and
Hmm.
understanding it and working it through can
Hmm.
be such a powerful experience for couples when they realize, oh my goodness, so we've still been in love all along. We
Hmm.
just didn't feel like it because we didn't know what we didn't know. And we can bring back hope,
Yeah.
right? Then we
Hmm.
can actually get from just bargaining to actually bonding.
Yeah.
Like
The one
that's
thing I'll tell you that you just spoke to that I see all the time with couples when I'm working with them. So one of the issues having ADHD as an adult is this emotional reactivity all day long, right? That something could just set you off and to an intensity that just doesn't make sense to your partner. But just as easily, because maybe we've got a working memory deficit, we've kind of forgotten what we were mad about. And something could also make us laugh and bring us out of it. And so so often I've seen people demonstrate this like tangible, incredible connection with each other. And we can laugh and cry in the same session. And I think they think that's just them. Like they don't quite understand that that's part of the magical part of ADHD,
Mhm.
right? So there's times when ADHD characteristics can really drag you down if you're not on top of it and really derail you. And then there's other times that it can be quite wonderful and resilient and buoyant and buffering in life,
Mhm.
and being able to know, like, just know that that's what it is pretty cool, right? And
Yeah.
then once you call it out, then you can actually protect and develop and cultivate that dynamic between the two of you,
Mhm.
you
Well,
know?
yeah, and this is where the differences was the attracting force in the beginning.
Right. That
Wow,
was real.
I love this about this person because they're so spontaneous, they're so creative, and over time, it's like I can't stand it because they're so flighty and flaky and they're so forgetful.
Yeah.
And just I mean, there's always going to be a shadow, but in the
Hmm.
end, it's forgotten. And
Yep.
what is so important is to really connect the couple again back to what it
Hmm.
was like in the beginning, when those very
Hmm.
things now that are the subject of a complaint were those
Hmm.
things that were so incredibly cherished. And
Hmm.
then how to actually bring that back into bonding. So
Yeah.
that way, there's a way that makes it safe for the couple to start to connect again. That's
Most
an important
certainly.
piece, is how do you make it safe? How do you make it safe and curious again so the couple starts to have less resentment and anger and says,
Hmm.
you know what? I think I want to be here and show up in a way to try to make this work.
Hmm.
That's critical, is making it safe, right?
Yeah. Like one thing, that's interesting, and we have this on our couples therapy information page on our website, is that there are some contraindications to couples therapy. Like if the relationship isn't physically safe, of course, but also if there's like some kind of untreated medical conditions, like mental health conditions that are symptomatic, that will get in the way of any work that we're going to do together. We can work with trauma, for example, within a couple relationship really well. So I don't mean that per se, more specifically, something like ADHD, because what happens is couples will make some gains. We initially make some gains. Everyone's got their heart in the right place. But then, some time passes and then we do a backslide because we weren't able to be consistent with the new normal. And that's kind of when my antenna goes up, if it's not something that they knew coming in to therapy, that consistent piece of being able to, it's not total consistency that anyone's looking for, but something closer than 50, something over a 50%, closer to 70%, I would say, you know. But when people address it, like John, what is the difference you've seen when well treated ADHD becomes something that becomes an asset to a relationship that you can work with?
Really, what's powerful here is essentially having a car using the right gasoline. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, if you're putting in diesel into the car and the car is running suboptimally, it's
Mm-hmm.
struggling to be able to focus, it's struggling to be able to regulate emotions,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to focus on a task for a longer period of time, to not get distracted or to go down a rabbit hole. What
Mm-hmm.
happens is that when we actually don't have our neurotransmitters in our brain
Mm-hmm.
working in our favor, we don't have that brain chemistry that allows for that. What happens is the brain needs better gasoline.
Yeah.
And whether it's going to be medication to treat or putting in behavioral processes or therapy in place to be able to support that individual, we're
Yeah.
expecting that car to be able to go into fifth gear on the wrong gasoline. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so imagine then if we have the right gasoline,
Mm-hmm.
so now the car can actually operate optimally.
Mm-hmm.
And all the motivation and intention of that person to show up in the relationship
Yeah.
now actually starts to fire. It
Yep.
starts to work. And
More
now you have
present.
two people more present, able to follow through, to
Yeah.
be reliable, to actually have less sensitivity when maybe there's a little bit of banter going on. And all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
we feel that sense of rejection and we take it the wrong way.
Yeah.
There's more tolerance for frustration. There's
Yep.
more attentiveness. All these pieces that make the operation of the team to work
Yeah.
much more smoothly. But it's a dramatic difference. It'll
Really
show up in
dramatic.
how you can slow down, have a better conversation, how to be
Yeah.
attentive, to be able to bond. So it's really about actually saying, okay, let's really look at this from the bottom up,
Right.
right? Let's, and this is something I learned from you. I just love the way you put this, is that we've got to make sure that we're ruling out what
Yeah.
could or couldn't be happening. Let's find out, because if we can actually have somebody consult professionals to say, here are some of the things that are happening to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm inattentive or I'm impulsive and it's affecting myself in terms of my day-to-day function, my work, and my relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm really curious to find out, could it be
Yeah.
neurodiversity,
Yeah.
right?
100%. I think that's like a really curious part of being a therapist. Sometimes feels a bit like being an emotional detective, right? We're constantly on a trail, a breadcrumb, trail hunt, looking for all of the things that make sense and discarding some things and pulling other things in. And oh yeah, we said that before, and putting together a picture as we really try and understand what somebody's experience of life has been like.
Mhm.
Because when I became a therapist, I very much took to heart the concept of non-judgmental stance and unconditional positive regard. So if the person sitting in front of me, I believe, is doing their very best, and they're not you know making something up or whatever, it's actually my job to help figure out what's going on that's in the way. If their heart's in the right place, and maybe execution or consistency is an issue, because I can feel it when someone's being genuine. you know
Mhm.
I'm a pretty good BS detector. So you know there comes this point where it's kind of like, I don't, we're saying this about you, but that's not what's in your heart. Like, let's just ask a couple more questions, because I think there's more than meets the eye right here. And it's quite a relief, because the partner, who is usually the one who's dragged this person into therapy, is has done so because deep down inside they truly believe there's something there too. It's just that it doesn't line up with all the Google searching and maybe what their aunt has said and whatever. And so it's, you know,
Mhm.
am I crazy for staying? What is this in my gut that keeps me connected to this person? And there's lots of stories out there that you can find that or about trauma and all that kind of stuff. And sure, that might be a factor in this. But I think, just if we come back to that place where, to your point, we remember all of the good stuff that brought us together, we have
Mhm.
to kind of figure out how far we departed from that in terms of the rhythm of our lives and what we're doing every day now, you know? And why has that happened? And probably a lot of it is a ton of external factors and pressures and stressors on the couple. right?
And yeah, and to your point about having empathy for the person sitting in front of us, and how do
Yeah,
we foster empathy between the two partners?
yeah.
And one of the things that is so powerful is as we start to understand what it was like for one person growing up with
Hmm.
untreated ADHD,
Oh my
how much
goodness.
they struggled feeling lost, alienated, feeling like they weren't
Yeah,
smart enough, they weren't good enough. I mean, they
yeah.
felt pretty crummy.
Attachment
And
trauma, right?
yeah, and it's that small T trauma, right? It's just like
Mhm.
water on a rock. Over year after year, the message
Yeah,
is
not
there
being
must,
validated. So thinking that oh geez, it's me. I'm not good
absolutely.
enough. If I
Uh,
was a better kid, they'd love me more. They'd pay more attention to me.
mhm. The core, I must be defective,
Mm.
right? And
Yep.
partner who comes to the dynamic who's not aware of it
Mhm.
may inadvertently say, I think they're defective. I mean, I
Mhm.
didn't see it in the beginning, but I'm sure it's there.
Yeah.
And really being able to get
That's the message.
each
Yeah.
person to understand what was it like for their partner growing up. And what's so powerful is to turn to the one person who doesn't know that their partner has a stone in their shoe
Yeah.
after hearing all what it was like in terms of growing up, is to ask
Mhm.
that person, what was it that your partner needed growing up?
Yeah.
An advocate. They needed an advocate, somebody who was going to go to bat for them, and to turn to them and say, and that's you. Wow.
Yeah. Someone who's got their back.
Yeah. And that is such a powerful bonding moment because now you've got a united partnership that can work on that stone,
Yep.
right? So
Yeah.
this is now more about just really looking at neurodiversity as not a liability,
Mhm.
just neurodiversity. And what does that mean? And how do we adjust?
Yeah.
So really getting informed, being educated, and having a multi-pronged approach to really
Mhm.
support. So we're looking at relational dynamic, we're looking at coaching tools,
Yep.
medicated medication, nutrition,
Mhm.
healthy exercise, sleep, trying to make it integrative so that they have the best and
All the
most
pieces
tools
fit
possible.
together. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, for anyone listening and for couples who maybe both adults or one of them is taking medication, one of the things that it was loud and clear at the ADHD conference that I attended in the fall. I think you attended too, Johnny. The
Yeah.
CADRA conference was that
Mhm.
it's if medication is a part of your toolkit and you're having benefit from that, that is phenomenal. It is not enough to have benefit only during your working hours or only during your school hours. We need to have benefit in the evening too, when we're home with our family. It's what's if you're the partner of somebody taking medication for ADHD and like things are great at work and they're more functional and they're happier at their job and they're more productive and they're getting better performance reviews over time, amazing. But then they come home and it's worn off and then they're tired and we're back to like a regular old untreated ADHD for a couple of hours together at home. That's not good either. So, I mean, the upside is that because we have the wonder of neuroplasticity, whether you're on medication or not, your brain is experiencing new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking. We do know that when people are consistent with their medication, they have better symptom control. And if they're not consistent with their medication, they actually can be more symptomatic. And so that becomes a thing where if it really is a problem in the evening, I'd encourage you to go back to your ADHD specialized physician to talk about evening coverage because there's certainly lots of strategies for that. Um, but then there's also behavioral strategies and interventions as well as like taking things off your plate, right? Like we're not superheroes. And that's part of why I don't really like the superhero kind of story that's out there sometimes about ADHD, because I think it encourages us to take on too much. And we really do need to be very picky about what we take on and what's on our plate. When you think that of all the things we're juggling as adults, our jobs, our kids, our relationship, ourselves are all balls that we're juggling. And then some of us can juggle 16 balls and some of us can only juggle 4. And we have to be really mindful of how many extra things that we're doing. And we always want to do things because that's what we do when we have ADHD and we have the capacity to do them, but it doesn't mean we should. And
Right.
I find that often comes into play in the evenings, like, oh, I can take on a couple of extra shifts because we need the money. But it's like, yeah, you could, but should you? Especially like, barreling down year 3 of a pandemic. Just putting it out there.
Well, you see, there's something about that. And what I've seen has been this pattern that I seem to have a little bit more time on my hands. Why? Because I don't have to be in a car and drive 45 minutes to work and then
Hmm.
come back and I lose that hour and a half, which
Hmm.
interestingly enough, that drive to and from work actually creates some structure for us. But now
Yes.
we're at home. And here's the challenge that I see so often with all of us, but particularly with ADHD, where the creative brain, the inspired brain is so powerful and it comes up with all these ideas, all these different things that we're going to do. And to your point, the list becomes so long. And next thing you know, it's like, oh my goodness, I have overcommitted because I've been over inspired. Now I'm not just multitasking, I'm overtasking.
Yeah.
And we can't do it. We start dropping balls. And then what happens is we actually start feeling kind of crummy because we're not following through on the very thing that we were so inspired that we probably told the entire world what we're going to be doing. And now we actually become demotivated and depressed.
Yeah.
And now we get stuck. And I love what you said. And that is really, in some ways, calibrating exactly what we can manage.
Hmm.
And if we get really clear on just 3 or 4 key areas of our life, like our health, our social circle, projects or work, and just
Hmm.
our mental health,
Hmm.
those 3 or 4 areas, and really try to focus on them to maintain balance at the same
Yeah.
time, then we're able to move forward and take
Yeah.
on things maybe once we get some more traction, but we'll feel
Right.
better that we're not overcommitting and then underperforming
Yeah.
and then feeling really bummed out about it.
Yeah.
So that balance is critical,
And
like you're
not being
saying.
shocked either, too, right? Like knowing, oh, in September, it's going to be hopefully fine, normal, back to school. But because
Mhm.
it's been so different, the kids might need a little extra support. So I'm not going to do my extra projects in September. I'm going to plan ahead to give myself spare time so that I'm more available, like that kind of thinking, right? Not
Mhm.
like I'm going to take on new things and then be really surprised when this shit hits the fan, you know? Like, which I'm totally have been guilty of, and I've learned the hard way not to do that. But it's this
Mhm.
piece of prioritizing and like weighting different things. And when do you chunk things out in the future? I think I heard this stat once that blows my mind that like people with neurotypical brains can like visually know what's happening in their lives for the next 3 weeks without looking at a calendar. Generally. Oh my gosh, really?
Wow.
I can't do that. I couldn't tell you what's happening in the next 48 hours without looking at a calendar, other than the fact that I think today is Tuesday, so I'm working.
Mhm.
You know, but if there's like an extra appointment in there or something that's different, I could not tell you unless I actually looked at my calendar.
Mhm.
And so I think that's interesting. So when you kind of live your whole life that way, you don't know that it's different for other people because it's the only brain you've ever had. So then to marry somebody whose brain works really differently, or their ADHD presents differently than yours because it can present very differently in different people, then that sense of feeling misunderstood by your person can be so painfully isolating. And so just clarifying a lot, I think, just makes such a big difference.
Mhm.
It provides so much clarity, which is nice.
And on that clarity, when couples start to understand, wow, so that's the stone? Yes. Wow. And then being able to provide some tools to be able to create moments for the couple to be able to have a really
Mhm.
constructive conversation. Because in the end of the day, it's where the loss of communication is going to be where resentment and blame game is going to fester. So
Yeah.
one of the ways to make this really safe for couples, once they start to understand what's going on, is teach them how to actually be what I call in a solving circle. Essentially,
Okay.
in that solving circle, you're committed to be there, and one person has the opportunity just to be able to talk about something that might be not necessarily an ultra hot topic, but it could
Mhm.
be a warm topic that really requires their partner just to be able to sit there and listen. Can
Mm.
I share something? Here's what's coming up. And it may actually relate to neurodiversity factors coming in into the relationship.
Yeah.
And it's really being able to teach the couple how to create a safe space with each other.
Mhm.
Because once they start to have those aha moments, they're not always going to be on the therapy couch. We need to
Yeah.
make sure that when they're alone, that they're able to have those moments to have
Yeah.
one conversations where the deal is that one person does the sharing and the other person just sits there and listens and takes in, maybe
Mhm.
even if they have to, just take some notes so that they can actually reflect back what they heard and
Yeah.
be able to be in that solving circle to be constructive in terms of problem solving.
Mhm.
That's also important. The other thing too is that by the time they get to this point, so much of the romance and just connecting has been lost because there's so much anger and resentment that
Yeah.
sometimes we actually have to build into that schedule bonding moments.
Yeah.
In other words, bonding really is going to be the source of the relationship to get strong again, not always being in bargaining mode, right?
Yeah.
In other words, okay, can we get on the same page as to-do list? Can we actually get on the same page on how we can talk, how there
Right.
can be holding hands, how
Yep.
we can actually just spend some time and really build back in a ritual that didn't have to be thought of in the
Right.
first 6 months or 2 years of the relationship.
Right.
So I think safety is really critical when it comes to once the aha moment starts to come in,
Mhm.
how does communication get fostered? How do bonding moments get promoted? That's
Yeah.
critical.
And those things, like by nature, are not something an ADHD brain pays attention to, in the sense that when we're untreated and we don't know that we have it and we haven't been exposed, like every day we wake up and it's just like putting out the next fire despite your best intentions. So that's how we get derailed. It's like, the day could be going along swimmingly. Boom, there's a fire lit in front of you, and like, whoop, I'm the firefighter. I am on that. And you constantly get pulled off your agenda to other things. And
Mhm.
sometimes they're cool, fun, interesting things. And other times they're more crisis like, and an ADHD brain lights up in a crisis, right? Fantastic. You want someone with ADHD when the shit goes down, because that's when they'll be like sharp and on, right?
Mhm.
And when you settle into a relationship and you're no longer the crisis as the partner, you're no longer the fire, because you're actually safe and consistent and predictable. And that can be misinterpreted as, oh, they're not interested in me anymore, or I'm boring, or we've lost the spark. And it's like, it's actually ironically wonderful that you're a place of safety. We just have to call this all out to attention. And your person is not paying attention to you because they don't want to. It's because the fire pulled them. But it's like that's not even what they want to be doing either, because they're exhausted, right?
And it's really interesting. And what often will come out of these conversations is that it feels like one partner is actually trying to cause conflict or instigate conflict.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
in some ways, the root of that is that they want to actually connect. It's just not a constructive way to
Yeah.
connect.
Oh, it's the only time you pay attention to me, right?
So now,
I'll light
although
myself on fire for you to pay attention to me.
that's right.
I think I've actually said that at one point,
And
right?
what's really interesting is that that becomes a dopamine hit. It's like, wow,
Sure.
that's reinforcing. And
Yeah.
and not only that, but it gives us something to gripe about with a friend, which then we
Mhm.
have somebody hearing, oh, really, really. And now we get the hit again, and the drama cycle takes
Yep.
over. And
Yep.
what's lost is the real healthy bonding. And so how
Mhm.
do we slow this down, have a better communication, and
Yeah.
then reinsert really bona fide, exciting things that the couple can do again
Yeah.
that's going to be healthy.
Novelty together. Yeah.
That's right.
Novelty, but together, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. My
Yeah.
stepdad used to say to me, to stay married, you got to love the oatmeal love. You got to get used to the oatmeal love. And that's what he referred to as just the everyday boring stuff
Yeah.
and finding joy and pleasure and injecting novelty into that.
Mhm.
And that's what that piece is about,
Yeah.
right? It's easy to look up and catch all the things that are exciting and training our nervous system to do something different when it really is just seeking homeostasis, right? Like when we're untreated and knowing, just calling that for what it is instead of feeling like it's a character defect. It's not. No more than somebody having type 1 diabetes. We want to say their pancreas has poor character. Sure, knock your socks off. You know, it's absurd. You know what I mean? So the more we understand this is the stone, I can't just take my shoe off and get rid of it. It's always going to be there. So how do we learn to live with it? How do we manage it? How do we work around the stone? Because I think sometimes the other partner can be like, well, just take your shoe off and get rid of the stone. Why can't you just get rid of the stone? You're treated now. Why are you still acting like you have a stone?
Mhm.
You know? And it doesn't work that way, right? Getting treatment for ADHD to say is not to make you act like you don't have ADHD.
Mhm.
And that's something that I probably never emphasized enough earlier, and I really try to emphasize it now more with people, because 'cause we're not trying to change who you are, we're just trying to untie your shoelaces for you.
Well, here's the thing. Imagine though, is boy, this stone in the shoe analogy is getting a lot of work today.
I
But
like it.
imagine here in this moment that we discover there's the stone in the shoe and somehow goes, aha, there's the stone. Let's get rid of that stone. But that person has been functioning with that stone in the shoe for so long
Mhm,
that part of what's in their DNA behaviorally is to steer a little bit leftwards on the floor, on the
mhm.
dance floor. So
They've adapted.
just because you take the stone out doesn't mean that they're going to be completely positioned in the middle of the dance floor. They're always going to have a little bit at moments of
Yeah,
steering off to the left. So I think it's about managing expectations and keeping that dialogue going. And
yeah.
one more thing that I think is so important is that although the couple comes together and they say, okay, I think it's them, I think it's them, and then we realize it's the cycle between us, plus we have the stone, we have the ADHD factor. The other thing too is that we also want to make sure that each person is also taking care of themselves.
Mhm,
Often it's kind of cliche to say, you need to get a life of your own. But
mhm.
that goes miles here. And the reason being is that each person has gotten to that point where the dance has gotten so bumpy that they do need to step back, not only to give space for their partner to shore up in whatever way they need to. For
Yeah.
one, it could be to release anger. For another one, to be able to learn new ADHD coping strategies. But what
Mhm.
has to happen over time is need to focus on themselves. In other words, John, what's important for you? What are some goals that you
Mhm.
have for yourself that are going to compel you to want to move forward, that are going to excite you and get you motivated? And
Yeah,
how do you actually honor some of the visions you have for yourself so that way you can actually feel like you're a priority to you, not just the couple,
yeah.
and then the other person does the same, where one person might say, one thing I've always wanted to do is be part of a book club or do some arts and crafts, like, painting or start up poetry or whatever that might be.
Yeah.
But they're so full of resentment from the relational dynamic that they don't have the bandwidth or don't give themselves the time to actually take up those hobbies
Yeah.
and to really step back and say, what's something that's really important? Well, I've always wanted to learn how to speak Spanish. Wonderful. Then taking that on as something that's important to enrich them.
Yeah.
And now you have two people enriching themselves that can come back to the relationship, which makes it way more vibrant because each person is actually more of a complete person now.
Yeah. There's something more to talk about at dinner time,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
other than like the laundry or the chores or who's doing this or who's picking up what or the same old, same old.
Yeah.
So to that part about it, it helps inject novelty into the relationship, right? Like we have to remember how to fun together, which is really hard in the times that we are right now. The
Mhm.
lockdown, financial difficulties, stressors with kids. It's hard to remember. You look over at your partner on the couch and be like, is that fun? Like, is that fun? Like, what are we doing? Like, where have the last 2 years gone? Like, there's a real like grief and loss that overlays all of this stuff.
Mhm.
But it's important to recognize that we need a break. ADHD brains need time to be creative. We need to be able to divert our focus and to do different things and to have other people believe in us too. And that's such an important thing to receive those positive messages instead of a negative cycle,
Mhm.
creating that culture of appreciation, that positive news cycle that we can do for each other. It's hard at first, but once you get practiced at it, it becomes much less hard.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that fun is so underrated, particularly in the last
Very.
couple of years. Our
Oh.
variety factor has gone down, and we need a certain degree of uncertainty. That's
Mhm.
really important for us to actually feel alive.
Yep.
And if we're feeling too much certainty in our partnership, that gets construed as boredom. And
Mhm.
now there's a disconnect that actually we go, you know what? I'll have to find my fun on my own. When we
Mhm.
want to bring it back, so that novelty factor, and that was your word, is bring novelty back into the relationship. And the
Mhm.
fun factor can allow for that uncertainty just to be enough to have
Yeah.
the relationship interesting again.
Yeah.
Fun is actually self-care,
It
right?
really is. And couples can have a whole lot of stress and manage it well when there's emotional safety in a relationship. It's when there's no safety that the stress becomes toxic and,
Mhm.
really unhealthy between them. And when there's lots of safety and no stressors at all on them, then that becomes boring. And then we get into trouble sometimes too there as well, right? So it's
Mhm.
always this right balance of safety and stress. And that's when we learn, that's when we can have joy, that's when we can play. And then, it's not like this like panacea of, oh, now we've reached this state. I think this is an everyday, we're disconnected multiple times all day long. And we're constantly searching back to make eye contact. Like, are you with me? Are we
Mhm.
laughing at the same jokes here? Are we still, am I still your person? You still there for me? And we ask those questions in really uninteresting ways like, oh my God, who did this again? Oh my God, who left the socks on the floor again? Which is my way of saying, hi, see me, pay attention to me. You
Mhm.
guys love me still? I should just say that, but I don't. I complain about the dishes in the sink
Mhm. Well, you see,
after I come home
complaining
from work,
feels better,
right?
doesn't it? I mean,
Sure
that's the
does
hit.
discharge lots of energy that way.
Yeah, that's the hit. When we get angry, it's another way of saying, I need to be
Mhm.
heard. I need to be seen. How do we become more constructive? And what
Mm,
happens is when it starts to get toxic, then
yeah.
it starts to become about the marriage. Oh my
Yep.
goodness, the marriage or our union, and
Mhm.
not about the relationship. And how do you bring it back and say, what is really the core here is our relatingness and our relationship. We're relating and we're sharing a ship of life together. How do we actually make this work? And
Mm.
so, in the end of the day, it's about how the couple can be really curious, having some compassion and caring for each other to figure out what's really going on here. Why
Yeah.
is our dance so painful and so messy? And how do we do this in a way that we've got a multi-pronged approach where we can be, to your point, like private investigators, to
Mhm.
be super interested in what's going on and actually finding a way through to
Yeah.
pick up why you actually got back, why you got together in the first place. But
Yep.
obviously, the relationship will evolve over time. But to actually get back to making it work, but
Yep.
making it fun and meaningful is so worth it.
Totally. Do you have like specific ways that you help couples figure out like how to remind themselves of these things, like how to stay on track with each
Mhm.
other?
Yeah, I think is to really keep it simple and just having a few things that overlap between the two partners that they circle back to at least on a weekly basis. It's almost like ritual time to sit down and saying, what's happening in terms of us? What's happening in terms of our family? What's happening in terms of the household? Just
Mhm.
staying on the same page so there's that sense of
Check-ins,
unison,
like
right?
routine check-ins.
Check-ins, right?
Yep.
And it's meant to be safe conversations. This is not necessarily being used to, okay, we're going to have a real big, deep issue conversation here. It's
Yeah.
just those kinds of really healthy check-ins. The other thing too is this is daily rituals. Takes a minute in the morning to say good morning and giving a hug or making a cup of coffee,
Yeah.
making breakfast, to at the end of the day when we used to need to come home, now we just go down the
Mhm.
hallway after we close down the computer. But to actually in the evening, just to be
Mhm.
able to come over and have some expression of, hi, how was your day? And a hug
Yeah.
or a kiss or whatever that might be, and even having some time together just to talk about how the day was. And we sometimes underestimate that as just sort of mundane day-to-day conversation,
No, they're
but
anchors.
that's important.
Yeah, they're anchors. I mean, I'm a big fan of like visual anchors, routine anchors, and there was a speaker that once said it's the rhythm of life. The more you can have a rhythm of life that is predictable, that includes your person, that day to day is anchored by like ritualistic things that you do to remind yourself of who you are, who they are, the easier it is to stay consistent with things. If
Mhm.
we're flying by the seat of our pants every day with different shifts and different schedules, and I only wake up if I need to versus just waking up because that's what you do at that time because you've got routine things that you're either accountable to other people or you've figured out. The more you can move towards that instead of flying by the seat of your pants, the healthier you'll be, both as a person and as a partner.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so important. Predictability and just enough to be able to have that rhythm of life that you're talking about in unison. And at the same time, having some spontaneity peppered in there
Sure,
or sprinkled in there. It's
of
really a
course.
fine balance between
It is.
spontaneity and predictability, isn't it?
So much nuance there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the third thing I think is really important is we often hear about love languages
I
or
love the love languages.
yeah, or even languages of comfort that I sometimes call, and that is, does my partner respond to touch
Yep.
or
No, like
talk?
knowing each other. Yeah.
Yeah. Talking, doing something for a partner. If you ask them, what would you like for you? Well, I'd love you to do the dishes. Well, what's important is that we make that a habit
Yeah.
to think about what is my partner, even once a week or a couple times a week, to think about what would be that really wonderful gift that I could give. And that actually
Mhm.
gets built into the ritual. And that's an
Yeah.
important conversation.
It's such simple things, right? Like it's less that my partner says I love you, but the fact that the coffee is there perking every morning already when I go into the kitchen says I love you, right? And
Mhm.
so, if you want to go straight to my heart, bring me a slice of pizza or a cup of tea. Like I'm pretty food motivated, like my puppy. So, but my partner knows this about me, and luckily we share that in common. But knowing those things is really, really important because we can spend a lot of time doing the wrong thing and feeling lonely in the relationship and exasperated by the fact that like I do all this stuff and my partner doesn't even notice. And it's like, well, because that's not how they receive love. That's not how they grow up receiving love. But if you do this other random thing, they feel loved even if you don't say the word "I love you." And
Mhm.
other people need to hear the words. So everybody's different, and we have to be able to do and intentionally do the thing that they need, even if it's not what we need. Like that's the part that's hard to remember.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting with the time we've been spending, we've come to that almost that behavioral ritual component.
Yeah.
What are we gonna do? Right? Because
Hmm.
that's the piece that falls off, that brings the couple into the office. is
Yeah.
that
What do we do
our
differently?
what we're doing is not what we used to do.
Hmm.
And now our dance is way off the center of the floor. Well, the key is that how do we actually then bring it back to what's so important about the couple being curious together, work on that
Hmm.
cycle to be
Hmm.
able to really look at treating for both individuals. So each person takes responsibility and can actually show up way more constructive and
Yeah.
much more, gameful as a couple, and then
Yeah.
start bringing in those rituals over time to really make it a habit. And
Hmm.
so we've got to look at what's happening in the dynamic, what's happening emotionally, what's happening with our executive brain when it comes to ADHD, and what's happening when it just comes
Oh,
to our habits. Because often, and there's a lot of literature on just better habits this and better habits that.
yeah.
And that's great if you can just go and read the book and put it in place. But there's a lot of introspective work that is needed, and learning
Hmm.
how to work on our respective emotions, learning how to communicate, and all those habits then are available because the couple is actually in a healthy relationship again. And
Yeah.
that to me is really the whole arc of the
Yeah.
process, which is wonderful over time.
Yeah. Like that's the transformation, getting to a point where we're bringing out the worst in each other because it just happened. It's a slide. You slide into that space. It's awful. To making intentional mindset changes and perspective shifts that pretty quick we're starting to bring out the best in each other. And we're starting to have these moments, we catch it in the therapy session, like these just moments where we start to remember who we were when we met and who we were in all of the great moments that we had together, and kind of being relieved that, oh, all is not lost. Like I remember that girl, I remember that guy, or that guy and that guy and that girl and that girl. I don't mean to be like just heteronormative about that, but that stuff is there for each other, you
Mhm.
know. And then once we've experienced that, it's like, oh, wait a minute, we can do this. It's really nice.
Absolutely. It's worth it.
Yeah. We could do like a part two. I feel like we could keep going on and on and on about this. There's still so much, right?
Mhm. Yeah. I think really what it comes down to, like the final thought for me is
Yeah.
this, it comes back to who's sitting in front of us and why are they there?
Yeah. Like what's the
They're
pain point?
That's exactly it. What is their anguish?
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, what that tells me is that if there's a pain point and there's anguish, boy,
Mhm.
they must matter to each other. Because if they
Yeah.
didn't matter to each other, there would be no anguish and there'd
They
be
wouldn't
no
be in front
pain
of
point.
us. Yeah.
Absolutely. So then
Yeah.
how do we get curious, start to become private investigators, show
Mhm.
what's possible, start getting some traction to shift that dance, the communication, the connection, the hope starts
Mhm.
coming back, and they
Yeah.
start to return back to those feelings they had in the beginning that had them say, wow, I think this is the right person. This
Mhm.
feels really good. But to
Mhm.
have that happen again, to go, wow,
Mhm.
this feels good again,
Mhm.
incredibly
After all
important.
this. Yeah.
And that's resilience,
That's pretty
right?
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. That is a good takeaway. I mean, I think for me on my end, it's that, of course, we are in the business of helping people stay together who come to us for couples therapy. And it's such a nice perspective shift when whether they know ADHD is a factor or whether we find out and we didn't know at some point along the way, because that's kind of centered on what we're talking about today. When they kind of realize that relief, that's like, oh, wait a minute, it's actually not us. Like there is, like to your point at the beginning, this variable that we didn't even know we were dealing with.
Mhm.
And then once we put that in its right place, like picture in picture, for that couple, for that family, how all of a sudden everything old becomes new again. How everything suddenly becomes, maybe we can do this. All for is not lost, right? And it's not always the case for everybody. Some people, the relationships run its course and there's lots of different things that are going on. But it really is kind of amazing. I think watching people make that transformation and knowing that it's possible. So I guess that's kind of like the message I really want to leave people with is, oh, it can feel so isolating and you feel so misunderstood and so lonely when you're trapped in like these defensive patterns or the find the bad guy dance or all of these things. And we have these like raw spots that we feel will never be healed. And we just feel defective, whether you're the person with ADHD or not. It just feels awful to be
Mhm.
in that place, right? And then to just know that there's so much light at the end of the tunnel when you do receive the right help from somebody that knows what they're looking at, can see it for what it
Mhm.
is really reassuring. Yeah. So John, thank you so much
You're
for
so welcome.
giving me your evening tonight to do this because I know people will be really happy to hear all of these things talked about in one shot. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Mhm. Well, they can come to our website at
Okay.
digalittledeeper.ca,
Okay.
or they can reach out John at digalittledeeper.ca. So
Okay. I'll put
I'm
that all in the show notes and I'll link
yeah.
your book too, because we actually didn't talk about the Compass book, but that
Mm.
is, it's not, I think when you first wrote it, it wasn't specifically about ADHD, but it very much is like an ADHD book. Am I right or no?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. In fact,
Yeah.
I think I was having one of those moments
Yeah.
after we went into the lockdowns, and here we are going, I might need some structure and some
Yep.
balance and some focus. So that's where it all came from. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm. So I'll link to that too so people can check that out if they want to check that out. And we might have to do a part 2 at some point.
yeah,
So stay tuned for that.
I will.
All
Thanks.
right. Thank you. Let me just